Okay, I think I'm live. Let me check on my phone. Yes, it looks like I'm live. Good morning, afternoon, everybody. I'm gonna pull this up on my phone as well so that I can share it. Give me one moment. Doing multiple tech things at once. Let's see. Peace of Christ. There we go. There it is. And give folks a chance to join us. I'm gonna share this on my own page. Okay. Oh, everyone's saying hi. Wonderful. All right, I'm gonna put this somewhere so I can see comments as we're chatting. All right. So, as you can see, it's just me this afternoon. Aurelia is not going to be introducing me today. So, I am AnaYelsi. I am joining you for the third week to discuss interlocking justice. So, we're just going to go ahead and jump right in since we already have about 7 folks. Hello. Oh, Aurelia's here. Naomi, Phil, Sierra, Tiffany. Um, so we have a lot of folks with us already. Um, and we're just going to go ahead and get started. It's week 3 of Interlocking Justice. And as I said, I'm AnaYelsi. So last week we discussed the Interlocking Justice Continuum, which, to remind you, illustrated how the 5 practices of interlocking justice are interconnected, simultaneous, and continuous. And if you remember, it kind of looks like the 5 rings, or you can imagine, I tend to imagine octagons, but it kind of looks like the Olympic rings. Um, we also did a dive into the first 2 practices, the interlocking justice practices, restorative practice, which is referring to how we honor the interlocking nature of all parts of oneself, body, mind, and soul, and integrity practice, which is referring to the relationship or approach to a relationship between 2 individuals within a collective, as well as how we engage movements as an individual. So, the challenge I left you with last week was to start asking yourself on a personal level, just as an individual, how are things lining up in terms of self and community care? And how are things lining up in terms of how you show up personally, politically, and professionally? When it comes to restorative and integrity practices, I wanted you to ask yourself kind of where you are now and what are ways you could begin moving forward in those practices. What are some first steps you could be taking? So that was your challenge for last week. We can go ahead and get started with the discussion for this week, for week 3. So for week 3, we're going to talk about community practice and we're going to talk about convergence practice. Community practice is a practice that focuses on group relationships within a collective, or you can also think of it as subsets within a collective. And convergence practice is the practice that focuses on the relationships between distinct collectives within the same movement space. So, within a movement or group of people working on the same problem or issue or concern. This is where the conversation really begins to feel more difficult, where interlocking justice really starts to ask a lot of people and can get a bit more challenging. Hi, Fran. Just saw that Fran joined us. This is where there begin to be a lot more moving parts, and it feels a lot less in our own control because you're asking things not just of yourself but of other people. So the deeper you get into implementing the practices of interlocking justice, the more buy-in you're going to have required from people, and the slower, more arduous the work is going to be. And I don't say that to intimidate you, but just to say that, like all good things, this requires work. It requires effort. Um, so, like restorative and integrity practice, There are aspects of these practices that can be worked on as individuals, and there are aspects that require the agreement of others. So let's talk about community practice. Community practice is referring to how we approach the dynamics within a single group, or I call a collective. Um, so these dynamics might include formalized or informalized subsets. For example, think of leadership at an organization or a company or a church, whatever. Imagine any entity in your mind, and think about the leadership and the workers. Those are two different subsets, and there's a relationship that's happening between them. It could also be groups of people of different races and ethnicities, people of different genders, different classes, religions, different abilities, those directly impacted by a problem and those not directly impacted by a problem. Say those are like are who are oppressed and those that aren't oppressed in a particular way. These are all subsets within a particular community, within a particular group. So community practice is referring to the dynamics of those subsets, how they interact with one another. And that can be a little confusing, but you just think of it that way. You have two groups, and community practice is referring to the dynamics of how those two groups within a group interact with one another. So this is not about how one individual treats another individual. That was integrity practice. Integrity practice is the one that's asking you is how you're treating one person, how one person is treating another person, lining up with how they say they want to present to the world or how they're trying to present to the world. Community practice is asking, is a group treating another group the way in which they say they present to the world? So this is about the treatment of one subset to another. Um, so I thought one of the things you can consider, since you're a piece of Christ Church, is to consider your own community. What are some of your own subsets? Perhaps you have people of color and white people. Maybe you have clergy and leadership, and then you have your congregation. So you have your clergy leadership subset and your congregation. Maybe you have younger and then older generations. Um, Maybe you have your native Texans and those that are new to the area. Um, Community practice would ask you as individuals and as a congregation to adopt an intersectional approach, a healing and holistic justice approach, to prioritize a decolonized and people of color centered model for justice, and so on, and into all of that into the way in which you navigate the relationship between those people. So I talked about in week one how I am not in interlocking justice asking us to do away with all of the other modalities, all of the other frameworks for justice. So this is one of the ways in which I'm actually asking us to incorporate them all together. So I'm saying that intersectionality, healing justice, all of them have components that are a part of interlocking justice. And in community practice, this is one of the ways in which you see that. There are components of all of those different frameworks that help us figure out how to take a posture in the way in which one group should be treating another group. And there are specific ideals that make up those different models for justice that should inform the way in which these groups interact with one another. So, the purpose of an interlocking approach to these relationships um, is to prevent or end unhealthy practices and address any harm that may have been caused as a result of those unhealthy practices. Um, so, to give you an idea of what some of those unhealthy practices might include, because there are a lot of them and I can't name them all, but some of them, extracting and tokenization. So, kind of using people to just get that check mark if we've got our Black person, our able bodied person, our Latinx person, um, a celebrity leadership culture that erases contributions, where you've just got your rock star, whether it's your founder of the organization or your rock star pastor or um, your speaker who can do no wrong, and then everybody else who makes the cogs in the machine, who makes things run day in and day out, all of their contributions get erased. That's an unhealthy model for a number of reasons. Self-sacrifice as a community expectation, the derision of self or community care, and the rewarding of burnout. Um, and I wasn't going to give an example for this, and then I was watching The Daily Show last night, and they were speaking on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it actually broke my heart what they were saying, what Trevor Noah was saying, because he started talking about all of the times that she had been severely ill or had been injured and then had just bounced right back or from a hospital bed, or just post cancer treatment or whatever it may have been at different points in time, um, was quoted as having like gotten right back to work or focused on the work or written a dissent, et cetera, in the midst of like great physical pain or injury, and all of that was being like applauded and accolades. And I just was really grieving that moment as I heard that, because that is rewarding something incredibly unhealthy and damaging. And we do that. That was a really big example of something we do every day to people, which is like, oh, the person who doesn't take any vacation days, the person who is there even when they're sick, even when they're ill, physically, emotionally, when they're in pain, when they're grieving, whatever it may be. We treat burnout as a sign of commitment, and it's so unhealthy. Um, the myth of exposure as fair compensation, power dynamics that are structured after a social hierarchy. So when you have your white people, your men, your straight cisgender people, your able-bodied people happen to always be the ones who are holding the positions of power, whether those are formalized positions or informal positions. Um, if your power dynamics are always structured after a social hierarchy, that's an unhealthy, toxic model. Um, and then there's a disposability culture that says community members are replaceable, that there's always somebody who's going to come right behind you. These are all the things that a community practice is working to address and repair the harm of or prevent harm from. Um, so then add on top of those things the insidious nature of stuff like white supremacy and toxic ideas and behavior like ableism and racism and transphobia and homophobia and academic elitism and xenophobia, and it goes on and on and on. Anti-blackness, there's just the list goes on. Um, a community practice that is consistent and vigilant about how we subsets engage one another should be addressing these things on a regular basis. Um, so I would want you to kind of take a moment and think about how within Peace of Christ subsets are engaging one another, and how a community practice might be able to note where these things are manifesting or have the potential to manifest, and you could begin addressing them. Adopting an interlocking framework, it means interrogating a group's current understanding of community, pinpointing those unhealthy dynamics, and devising a detailed plan for addressing changes. So it's not just making the plan and then being like, "Oh, that was really great," and putting it in a drawer, but doing something about it and being consistent with it. It's more than just a community agreement. It's taking concrete steps. So it's a substantial amount of work that goes into this, which takes us from community practice to convergence practice. Aurelia says she spies Matt, who's my husband. Matt, wave. You've been spotted.
Oh, hi.
I think you. I don't know if you can hear him. um. So convergence practice. Oh my gosh, a big bug just flew on my computer. What is that? What is this creature? Okay, that really threw me off. I don't know what this creature is.
It's a little weevil.
It's a weevil, apparently. That's concerning. All right, well, that's going to be on recording and on video. Convergence practice. Wow. Jumping right back in. Convergence practice is referring to how we approach the relationship between two or more distinct communities, like humans and bugs. No, like informal groups, nonprofits, faith communities, or some other entity. Um, so this is movements that are communities that might be working within a movement space, but they're working, say, in different geographical locations, or they're working in different ways. So, like one is direct service and another is direct action, meaning one is working on a system level and one is meeting like immediate needs. So they're taking different approaches. Um, it's a bit easier to see opportunities for partnership and collaboration in convergence practice work because you're clearly like and focused on addressing the same problem or serving the same community. There's a natural overlap in convergence practice. Everyone is laughing at me in the bug. um, Pursuing these relationships can range. It has like a broad range of how this works. So my expectation is that not, as you're beginning to incorporate convergence practice into your work, whatever that work may be, that you immediately jump into partnerships with everyone. That would actually be very unhealthy. But that folks would begin as individuals and as communities to take steps towards convergence practice. But some of the ways in which convergence practice could be embodied is it could range from an acknowledgement simply of the validity of somebody else's approach to the work. So one of the examples I created is, um, say you have a community organizing group and they're focused on changing laws regarding gender-based violence, but that group still publicly takes the time to celebrate and advocate for a healing collective's efforts to care for the victims of gender-based violence. So you have this healing justice collective who's meeting the immediate needs of victims of gender-based violence, and you have this um, uh, community organizing group that's working on a system level that says, all right, you're doing your own thing, you're doing it differently, and we celebrate you and we acknowledge you publicly, and we're also doing our own thing differently. So it's simply an acknowledgement of one another's work. Um, and the broad other end of the spectrum could be a direct partnership. So maybe that same community organizing group could partner with the Healing Collective. They could go so far as to apply for a joint grant that furthers both of their endeavors and helps and furthers the work of both groups, serving that those folks who have been impacted by gender-based violence. Um, Bring it home a little bit more and think about Peace of Christ. Think about congregations, about churches. How might a church engage interlocking justice and the convergence practice? So, as a part of convergence practice, a congregation may decide to directly partner with other congregations. So, maybe you want to fund or host an ecumenical event for the community. Or maybe a church decides to have their service ministry. Maybe a church has a service ministry and it's an after school program, and they realize that there's a local rec center that is also struggling to keep their after school program afloat, and they can partner with them and combine those after school programs. They're not both ministries, they have very different approaches, but they're doing the same work. They're serving the same group of people, so they can do that work together. That is a convergence practice. But it takes a lot of intentionality, which is why a lot of folks don't necessarily take that step. um, so, convergence practice is really asking the question of how can we honor and celebrate one another's work, even if we're doing it in different places, in different ways, and with different postures. How can we find ways to maybe even partner together in that work? Um, and at the very least, asking how can we make sure that when we do our own work, we're doing it in a way that mitigates any harm or damage we might do to somebody else's work, or erases any harm or damage we might do to their work. Because there are sometimes we have efforts, campaigns, projects which cause stalling or pain or frustration for others that are trying to do good work. And because we're not taking a posture that intentionally includes the question of how does my work impact everybody else, and really takes the time to think that through and ask what is everybody else doing, we don't realize the impact we're having. And merely incorporating that question into our endeavors is a really important part of convergence practice. So, my challenge for this week, um, because not everything can start with, all right, how as a group do we just incorporate this? So, my challenge is start with as an individual. Take an individual approach to community or convergence practice. Ask yourself, what collectives are you a part of? What groups are you a part of within those collectives? What are the ways in which you can advocate for an interlocking approach to relationships in those within those communities? What could be accomplished as a result of that? So start identifying the groups you're a part of, the subsets within those groups, how the dynamics work within them, and what kind of steps forward you could advocate for. What are the things that you could name and identify and begin speaking into to incorporate both a community and a convergence practice? That's it for this week. So hopefully we can join each other again next week, same time. Thank you, everyone.